Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Landon Mitchell Show. I'm your host, Landon Mitchell. Today we have a very distinguished guest. We're here today with Professor Christopher Bosso. Professor Bosso, please go ahead and introduce yourself for the podcast.
Great. Thanks, Landon. Again, Christopher Bosso, professor of public policy and politics at Northeastern University in Boston. My areas of expertise and the reason why we're here is food policy and politics. And my most recent book is entitled Why SNAP Works, A Political History and Defense of the Food Stamp Program.
And for those of us who are unfamiliar, could you briefly explain what SNAP is and how it functions?
Well, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, is the nation's largest government-supported food assistance program for those in need of food. Basically, it's a nutrition assistance program officially, and it's a food assistance program that basically provides cash-like benefits. They're not cash; it's cash-like. I'll get that in a second. To households that are about 130% under the federal poverty line. So, for example, a family of four that makes less than $45,000 would be, eligible for SNAP benefits, and that takes into account living expenses such as rent, heat, owning a car, that kind of thing. So, it's really a supplement to low-income households to enable them to purchase more food. And if you're eligible, you get a certain amount in benefits per month based on your family household size and your income. Income after certain expenses. That say let's say you're a family of four, your maximum benefit would be roughly $600 a month, maybe a little bit more. You would get that money put into an EBT card, or electronic benefit transfer card, to be used to purchase food, and only food, at any participating retailer, whether it's Walmart or your local convenience store. And again, it can only be used for food. And it can't be used for non-food items, cannot be used for alcohol, cannot be used for cigarettes, cannot be used for hot prepared food, can only be used for food that you prepare at home. So the idea behind SNAP is really to supplement the nutrition of low-income households. And that's really its origins in the current food stamp program going back to 1964 when it was enacted, and back to the Great Depression, actually, is when the idea behind the food stamp program sort of was first piloted. So, the program, as I detail in my book, has a very long history in some respects. Again, going back at minimum 60 years, but in some respects longer than that, depending on how far back you want to trace it. And to the point today where it's the nation's largest government-supported nutrition program. How's that?
Yeah, it was a really good start. Thank you very much. And um, one of the interesting things is that it's just like one food assistance program of many, and one food assistance program people might also be familiar with is WIC, Women, Infants, Children.
Right.
And in WIC, if I recall correctly, there are limits on what people can buy with WIC,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
this has come up a lot with the Trump administration's recent proposal to cut the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. Some advocates of that proposal are saying, well, there should be limits on what people can buy with SNAP. There are no limits right now, although studies do suggest that people who are receiving SNAP are basically buying what the average American family buys. So I was just wondering, what are some of the implications of this proposal? Because I want to say it's a bad idea for the same reasons it would be a bad idea with SNAP. But how is it that WIC came to be different?
Well, WIC from the very beginning was focused on women with children or who were about to have a child, or lactate, women who are basically with infants and children up to 5 years old. That's the point of the program. Because it was back in the 1960s when this program emerged, there was a special concern about young women with children who were not nutritionally having adequate nutrition. And if you're mother who does not have adequate nutrition, your children are not going to be adequately developed. You're not going to develop adequately. So this was WIC is a very different kind of program. It's targeted to a specific subset of people, women with young children or infants under the age of 5. Because of child development concerns more than anything else. So it's very specific. It's a voucher card. It's not, you literally take a card with you to the grocery store, and it's very specific as to what you can get with it: milk, yogurt, certain kinds of cereals, certain kinds of. You can get, for example, yogurt, but it has to be plain yogurt. You can get wheat bread. You can get white potatoes. There are all kinds of restrictions on WIC because it's focused on nutrition in a narrow sense. Now, SNAP doesn't have restrictions for a lot of reasons. One, that the sort of the difficulties of administering a program where you have all kinds of restrictions gets really difficult, even with EBT cards, and gets complicated at the retail site. I mean, anybody who's ever watched a WIC card being redeemed knows that it's a pain for everybody. And so the idea that you would have all kinds of restrictions or rules on SNAP, and this goes back to the very beginning, was that they decided against them because it just was administratively a hassle. It was also would create all kinds of problems at the retail point of purchase, because literally you would have to have separate. In the old days with food stamps, the actual food stamps, you actually would have separate cashier lanes for food stamps because it was so administratively burdensome. So the idea that, and also the food industry hates the idea of that there's good foods and bad foods, as does the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They really have resisted this. And again, the programs for different purposes. I mean, as you point out, families that are using SNAP really are not all that different in how they purchase food from any other family of similar income, or even a lot of American families in general, for the same reasons. I mean, they buy the foods that are affordable, that they're convenient, they're tasty, that they can provide, they can prepare quickly. Because, again, there's a same time stress dimension that low-income families in particular have than any other family. So there's no real good evidence that restricting SNAP use, for example, on sodas would have any impact on soda purchasing. I mean, sodas are cheap. If you restrict SNAP use on soda, for example, well, most SNAP households have some cash. They'll buy, if you spend $2 on a 2-liter bottle of Coke if you want, they'll do it if they want to. So it's not going to have any impact, really, and it would be administratively a headache. They're about to discover that, frankly, in the states where they're going to have these pilot projects for SNAP on sodas. It won't have much impact on consumption, and it'll be a pain. It'll be a real pain on the retailers who don't like it at all.
Yeah, it's sounding like a lot of this is political rhetoric over actual policy analysis. What the Trump administration is doing and what these states are doing. I mean,
well, there are some well-meaning folks out there, people who really are concerned about the overconsumption of sugar, for example, among Americans, or who are really concerned about the people's purchase and overconsumption of what we might call ultra-processed foods. I mean, Robert Kennedy, for example, is concerned. Has expressed a concern about that, and there's a lot of nutritionists who are concerned about it. And for some of them, restricting SNAP use to so-called healthy foods would be, in their view, a good way to at least try to get people's nutrition better. My view is that that's probably misguided. It's just not going to work very well. And it's a bit paternalistic, in my view. Again, that's my attitude about it. I mean, I feel that that everybody should have some choice in their lives. But again, we'll see what happens with these so-called pilot projects. My gut tells me, not just gut. Reading all the literature tells me that these pilot projects are not going to have their intended effect.
Mm. And this kind of also goes to the commodity distribution model that you discuss in your book. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea of basically assembling a kind of like food box
Right.
of items that are supposed to feed a healthy family or whatever the household size is.
Sure.
And some people, I think during the first Trump administration, discussed going back to the commodity distribution model.
Hmm.
Is Are you seeing any resurgence in that kind of conversation since Trump has been reelected? And what
Not
are
as
some of the problems
yeah.
with the commodity distribution model?
Well, I mean, I haven't seen much talk yet in this Trump administration about it, but don't worry, it'll come back because, again, for a lot of the reasons that they thought about in the first place, the idea that poor people shouldn't have choice, and that the government can do a better job choosing food for you than you can choose for yourself. I mean, my objections to it are, I mean, there are some populations in society where this does in fact work. We do have some programs, very specialized programs already. There is a commodity distribution program for the elderly, where people who can't go shopping. So, food banks working with the USDA will put together a commodity box that gets shipped gets shipped then to a social service agency, where they add maybe some fresh fruits and vegetables to it, and then they take it to the recipient's home. But that's a very small program. Or there's some commodity distributions for native reservations where they don't have access to easy access to grocery stores. But those are very small by comparison. Commodity distribution is, first of all, it's expensive to do. You're talking about pulling together a lot of bulk food, putting it, someone's got to organize it into different boxes, then ship it somehow to everybody who is going to get the food. Think about this for a minute. You're basically going to put together an entire distribution system to do this one thing. Well, again, most people, it's a lot cheaper for the government, and a lot easier just to give people money, or SNAP benefits in this case, to go to the store themselves and buy the food. So again, there's a lot of objections to bringing back commodity distribution as the core government program, on a lot of logistics arguments, cost arguments, arguments about, for example, the quality, and not the quality so much as the types of food offered, cultural appropriateness of the food. People. I mean, with SNAP, you buy what food you like. With commodity distribution, you might get stuff you don't like or don't know how to prepare. And the old commodity distribution programs from the 1940s through the 1960s and early 70s, which SNAP replaces essentially, basically a lot of people didn't like them because they hated the idea of, getting in line for food was demeaning. And even if you ship the food to people's houses, there's still that bit of, that's one argument. But again, people can buy their own food more easily. But it was demeaning. And retailers hated it, because if you give people food for free, then they're not going to go shopping at your store. And even, again, low income people with SNAP still are going to buy other stuff at that store. And so the whole point of SNAP, or food stamps, before it, was that you would enable people to use the regular channels of commerce, go to the store to buy food. And everybody, and again, SNAP has survived because, despite the critiques, most people like SNAP as a system. It's better than the alternatives in many people's views, and especially commodity distribution, which everybody, I would guarantee, would find the worst case, the worst possible alternative.
Right. And in terms of cultural relevance, I mean, a lot of people who are, say, Buddhist or Hindus or Jains, they need to eat vegetarian diets. And obviously, you don't want to get spam in your commodity box when
Right.
you're following a vegetarian diet. Or even like these people have such really different
Right.
like nutritional needs.
Or
Like
what happens if
you
you're
could get
gluten
something you're
intolerant?
allergic
Sure.
to.
Exactly, and that's the dilemma. And basically, you could, in theory, tailor all these boxes to everybody's different dietary needs and interests. But then you get to see the point. Once you start doing that,
Mm,
really complicated, really fast, you have to set up an entire apparatus to do this. when in fact you don't have to because, well, again, people can go to the store themselves. Or nowadays, in most states now, you can order your if you're on SNAP, you can order your food online and get what you want and have it delivered. You know, I mean,
Mhm.
you have to pay your own delivery fees, but still, I mean, again, notice the point. SNAP is arguably it's arguably a better program than the alternatives because it's more efficient. It gets food to people more easily than the other system. It gives people choice. It fits their culinary and dietary needs. Um, and short of giving people cash, which we don't do because we don't trust poor people to spend their money wisely. SNAP probably is the most efficient, best way to provide food to people.
Right. And one of the things you discuss in your book is that the reason why SNAP isn't a cash based program seems to just be politics more so than policy. Is
Oh
that
yeah, definitely.
correct?
I mean, it's a cultural thing. We don't like welfare. So the idea of cash welfare. So we don't trust poor people to spend their money wisely. That's an old, going back, decades, even a century. The suspicion is if you give poor people cash, they'll spend it on booze and alcohol and cigarettes. Um, so we actually have a pretty extensive social welfare system, despite what people think. But it's all indirect. It's housing vouchers, like Section 8 vouchers. It might be heating support, for, low-income heating program. It might be vouchers for mass transit. It might be tax credits, the earned income tax credit, EITC, for working low-income people. And it's SNAP. Again, SNAP is not direct cash. It's cash-like, but not cash. So everything we do in the social welfare system is pretty much non-cash based. We actually have very small direct cash kind of welfare system in this country. General assistance, or there's actually a very small portion of our welfare system is cash because we just don't trust poor people to spend their money wisely.
Hmm. And one of the interesting and striking moments in your book is when you talked about something that happened during the Great Depression when
Mhm,
farmers would destroy food while people starved.
mhm.
So, this obviously has given rise to a lot of conspiracy theories, especially amongst the type of person who maybe listens to people like RFK.
Yeah.
So, why did farmers destroy food while people starved?
Well, I mean, it wasn't
And
intent. They didn't do, well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, I was going to ask, what are the economic forces behind this decision, and um, what was the government's kind of response to that?
Well, right. Well, actually, farmers started destroying crops uh, at the government's behest in 1930, in the 30s. And the problem was that farmers, if you're an individual farmer and you plant your crop, say in March, in this hope that you're going to get a certain price for that crop, per ton, when you harvest it in the fall. And what do you do if the price that you hope to get drops by 40%? And you can't, and the price basically is lower than your cost of production. Um, and so farmers, basically the individual farmer is sort of caught in a bind. Do I? You're not going to not plant because you're not going to, if you don't plant your crop, you're not going to make any money. You'll go out of business. If you plant your crop and you harvest it in the fall, and there's nobody who's going to buy it at the price that essentially need to make to break even, what are you going to do? So farmers, you know, began to band together to, say, pour milk down the drain, for example, or burn wheat in hopes of, basically reducing the supply so that it would boost commodity prices to the point where they can actually break even, if not make a little profit. So the point was, and this is the good point, is that our food assistance programs in this country are within the context of an abundance of food. We have a lot of food in this country. That's not the problem. We have food is everywhere. And the problem in the 1930s was you had farmers who were producing, and there wasn't enough, demand for a lot of reasons I won't go into. So if you're the government, this is 1933. If you're the government, you're trying to save, as many farmers as you can, at least the farmers who are productive farmers. But in order to do that, you've got to keep commodity prices stable and at a certain point so that farmers can make a profit. Otherwise, they go out of business. They lose their farms. Because again, farmers are usually planting crops by taking out loans. If they can't repay their loans, they're out of business. They lose their farms. So the government initially, this is under the Roosevelt administration, the government basically began to say, all right, maybe if we reduce the supply by destroying crops, that will stabilize agricultural prices, and farmers, reduce the supply. Farmers can make a little profit. Prices will go up for consumers, but we need to sort of save the farmers too. At the same time, you've got people, again, 25% unemployment. You've got people standing in bread lines. So people were outraged you can imagine the outrage at the idea of burning crops or slaughtering animals and then burying the animals rather than feeding, rather than using the meat to feed people. People were outraged at the idea. So that's what started the commodity program. The government would buy the government would buy commodities from farmers and store it. And you had these surplus commodities, and then they would ship out the surplus commodities to the states and local governments to give to those in need. Again, the idea of the commodity box, that's where it comes from. But again, as I pointed out, it's all done to keep commodity prices stable and so the farmers can keep in business. So, for example, I'll give you a good recent example. When Trump had his first trade war with China in 2017-18, the Chinese basically said, all right, we're not going to buy your pork or your soybeans or corn. And so we had huge amounts of pork and soybeans and corn that were surplus. The government bought those commodities, and in many respects, sent farmers a lot of compensation, but shipped some of those surplus commodities, especially the pork, to food banks. For example, the point is that this dilemma of balancing the needs of farmers and the needs of the food insecure is a tension in our policy space that's been there for 90 years easily. So the idea of destroying food is morally abhorrent to people, but a lot of times, you do it. I mean, it still happens occasionally. During COVID, it happened because literally the crops were rotting in the fields, and there was a temporary glitch in supply chains. So farmers had no choice but to let the crops rot because they didn't have a market for the crops. So you get these kind of moments where this happens. And so you can imagine that, again, SNAP is a way of boosting consumption of crops so that, the food system has this equilibrium in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And you call this situation in your book the paradox of want amidst plenty, that
Right.
we have so much food, yet people don't get enough food or get enough nutrition.
Right. It's because they don't make enough money.
Yeah,
I mean, the
exactly.
primary reason for this is people don't make enough money. That's the primary reason why you have food insecurity. The single reason is income, wages. Yeah, I mean, we know that.
Yeah, like if you go to like a impoverished area where they have a Dollar Tree instead of like a Whole Foods, they have to sell cheap and expensive
Mhm.
food with very little nutritional value because their customers just can't afford anything else, right?
Now, to be blunt, for example, Dollar Tree. If Dollar Tree is SNAP eligible, it has to have a certain percentage of, fresh fruits and vegetables and milk, that kind of stuff, and other things. It has to have that kind of stuff there. The government doesn't just enable you to use your SNAP benefits anywhere. You have to qualify. But the threshold's relatively low. So you can go to a Dollar Tree and there's going to be fresh milk there, maybe, and some fresh fruits and vegetables. but most of it's going to be canned goods and dried goods, of course, if any Dollar Tree. So you're going to spend most of your money. Again, SNAP, people using SNAP are rational actors. They're going to spend the money on what they can afford.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
so we have the Agricultural Adjustment Acts of 1933 and 1935, which you mentioned, and they kind of laid the foundation for the food assistance from the federal government by creating the commodity bars, right?
Well, they really were more focused on, the commodity box things were really sideshows. The primary goal of those agricultural assistance acts, the original farm bills, was to manage production. So a lot of the focus on those in those laws was in helping farmers manage production, so the farmers could make a living. So there would be quotas or acreage restrictions. Very little. There's almost nothing in those bills about consumption side. Commodity, but the commodity programs that emerge were really sort of afterthoughts in a way. They had all this food that they were getting because they were buying up surplus commodities to keep the prices stable. What do they do? What do they do with the food? I mean, you could store some of it for a while, but at a certain point, you got to do something with it. I mean, food, even canned food and dried food, is perishable at a certain point, as we all know. So that was the dilemma. So the Agricultural Adjustment Acts really were more focused on production. But then this problem of what do you do with the surplus food became an issue, and they had to figure out ways to use it by shipping it to poor people, basically. And that's when, of course, then the SNAP pilot projects, the late 1930s, that's where that came from.
And is this where we get to the 1939 food stamp program?
Yeah, basically. I mean, again, the retail food company, the retail food retailers, grocery store guys, hated commodity food programs because, again, my point earlier was that, if I'm getting free food from the local food pantry, I'm not going to your store and buying anything, or very little. And at least the money's going through. Again, remember, when I use my SNAP benefits at my local Walmart gets compensated for that. They get paid by the federal government for the SNAP benefits I use. So that's income. Rather than me getting free food, I'm still getting my food from the government. I'm getting it, though, in a way that benefits Walmart too. So Walmart, the food companies like SNAP because it's not competing with them. That commodity programs essentially are competition.
So during World War II, the paradox of want amidst plenty kind of disappears to some extent because
The surpluses
um,
disappear.
yeah, because we're sending our soldiers to war and they need to eat a lot of food,
We're
and
shipping
we're
food to
shipping food to
our
our
allies.
allies. Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
And of course, more people at home are working. I mean, we have a labor shortage because millions of being in the military, and you got women in the workforce. So everybody's working and they're making incomes. And when you make incomes, you buy better and more food. So again, most of the surpluses disappear during the war because you have massive demand.
Right. And after World War II, the paradox returns,
Right,
and
in the
I,
late
th-
40s.
I think one of the reasons for that is there's the Cold War that eventually forms, and the United States isn't trading with those countries. I
Right.
would assume, right?
I mean, there's very limited trade. I mean, obviously, trade with essentially Russia, China doesn't exist, or and the Europe and the Eastern Bloc countries doesn't exist. Also, the agricultural sectors of European countries and Asian countries that got decimated during World War II, they bounced back, and so and more countries are producing more food, so there's less of a need, less of a demand for our food. Now we still become a major exporting. We're still a major exporting power when it comes to agriculture, But the surplus becomes a problem again in the late 40s and through the 50s when the government essentially is buying up massive amounts, mostly grain, but other things as well, because again to keep prices stable, and they're shipping some of it over to other countries in the Food for Peace program. But you're right. I mean, the trade with other countries sort of levels off because we're not shipping food to Europe anymore because Europe's feeding itself again.
Hmm. And so after the war, um, we get into the 50s and we get into the Eisenhower administration.
Right.
And you write that the United States Department of Agriculture Secretary Ezra Benson was
Ezra Taft
resistant
Benson. Yeah.
he was resistant to food relief programs, and so there wasn't any new food assistance program from the federal government during the Eisenhower administration. So, what was Benson's philosophy on food assistance?
Well, basically, Benson's view was he was a free market guy. He basically was the view that let farmers produce as much as possible and let the markets figure it out. And by the way, under Eisenhower, you did have the Food for Peace program where we would ship, again, say wheat and rice and corn to places like India, to deal with famine and stuff. I mean, so this is before India became self-sufficient during the Green Revolution of the 60s. So the Food for Peace program was one way of dealing, and it is to this day, and well, until the current administration sort of has sort of defunded it a bit. You basically, again, you bought surplus commodities. The U.S. government would ship surplus commodities to other countries. But Benson, being a free trader, felt that again, farmers should produce what they that again, farmers are rational business people, get big or get out, and that the market will sort it out, and that if food was cheap, then the issue of food assistance programs would not be as important because food was cheap. And that was the idea. The cheap food narrative was that food would be inexpensive enough that even low income people could afford it. Now, that didn't always work out, as we know. There's lots of reasons. But, that was his philosophy. And that was in the philosophy of essentially Midwest Republicans in particular, especially those from certain areas of the country where they produce corn and wheat, in particular, who basically wanted the market to sort of function that way.
Mhm. And so, in this point in the narrative, we might introduce a sort of heroic figure, in my opinion, kind of an unsung hero, and that's Representative Lenore Sullivan,
Right.
who was a woman. And
Right.
often people give JFK credit for restarting food assistance programs from the federal government. But we can see Lenore Sullivan was advocating for it quite some time before JFK.
Yeah, no, she was active she was from St. Louis, and she was frustrated by the fact that we had all this food out there, again, the surpluses. We're spending a lot of money to store surplus grains, millions of dollars. At the same time that she's got destitution and poverty, and people are going hungry in her city. And she thought she knew about the food stamp program. A lot of people in Congress knew about the old food stamp program, and she really advocated to bring it back as a more efficient, better way to deal with food insecurity, hunger at that time. And so Congress passed a law in 1958 enabling the USDA to engage in these pilot projects. That was primarily because of Lenore Sullivan. Now, Eisenhower chose, Ezra Taft Benson chose not to do those pilot projects, but that's when Kennedy comes on board and does those pilot projects based in part on the authority Congress gave him, but also on other authority. But the point is that you're right. There were people in Congress like Lenore Sullivan who've been pushing food stamps throughout the 1950s, saying this was a better way to feed needy people. And so Kennedy basically becomes one of those believers in it, sees the need during this campaign in 1960, and institutes the food stamp pilot projects during his administration. And then, of course, after he's assassinated, Lyndon Johnson moves the food stamp program through the 1964 Food Stamp Act. So that's where it becomes law. But yeah, you're right. It was Lenore Sullivan who was a major mover of the food stamp program's revival.
And here we're also seeing like the coalescing of rural and urban political interests.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, Lenore Sullivan was from the representative city, St. Louis, Missouri,
Right.
and her city was very impoverished, very malnourished. And she begins to work with representatives from rural areas. to
right,
kind of build this coalition that's persisted across time,
right,
to support SNAP and keep it going
right.
against all this pushback. So how did that coalition form, and really quickly, like how did it like evolve
Well, the
over time,
coalition was
and
very
how is it
simple.
today?
Well, in very simple terms, the coalition was rural conservatives who want support for commodity programs for cotton, for soy, for whatever. Um, Knew increasingly they didn't have the votes in Congress as Congress became, especially the House, became more urban and suburban. That those rural conservatives, rural legislators, needed the votes of urban and suburban legislators, and urban and suburban legislators said, "Well, all right, no food stamps. If you don't support food stamps, we're not going to support your wheat or your cotton or your other commodity programs." So that's the coalition that has held it together pretty reasonably well until relatively recently. That's the deal. It's all based on pure self-interest. You vote for my food stamps or SNAP, I'll vote for your farm programs. Purely
Right.
self-interest.
And this goes back to why SNAP isn't cash based, because a lot of people from the rural areas are Republican representatives and they have more of that stigma, right?
Exactly. And also,
Yeah.
and also because it's not cash, it makes it easier. Because it's about food, it makes it easier for them to support. Even now, you look, all the Project 2025 based kinds of cuts that they're talking about, they're not talking about getting rid of SNAP, they're talking about making changes in it. That shows you the power of the program because it's about food. At the end of the day, even a lot of conservatives don't want fellow Americans to go hungry. So they can
Yep.
live with SNAP as long as there's restrictions.
Yep. And maybe that's an area that we can all explore in more depth as we try to find common ground through this really tumultuous political era that we're living in.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
so thank you very much for your time, Professor Bosso. Thank you for appearing on the podcast.
My
It was
pleasure.
very interesting to hear, and perhaps I'll have you again sometime.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you. You too.